Thank you all for being here tonight at the Statakion Center for the sixth lecture of our weekly Federation 205-250 Greek Independence Day Parade 2026 in New York lecture series. Tonight, our lecture will be on the foundation of 1821, Hellenic and Philhellenic women in the making of Greek independence. The Greek Revolution was not sustained by those who carried arms, only by those who carried arms. It was sustained by those who carried life through war and across the entire arc of the struggle, from its pre-revolutionary matrix to its transatlantic afterlife. Women formed the human structure that made independence possible and made its meaning universal. Long before 1821, in the mountain confederation of Souli, the society existed in which resistance was not an episode, but a permanent condition of life. In that society, women were not outside the mechanics of war. They were its essential infrastructure. They moved ammunition along the steep paths that connected the settlements, rationed food under siege, guarded children and the elderly during forced migrations, and preserved the cohesion of the clan in exile as in other areas of occupied Hellas. In Moscho Tzabella, we see the political intelligence and the military authority of this world in its clearest form. When the Souliote men were engaged in distant fighting and Ottoman forces attempted to exploit the moment, it was Moscho Tzabella who gathered 400 Souliote women, armed them, and led them into combat against a non-Ottoman force, defeating them, and they suffered 2,000 to 3,000 casualties. The battle that followed was not an act of desperation, but a disciplined defense of the homeland, fighting with the weapons at hand and with the absolute knowledge that defeat meant enslavement. The Souliote women drove back the Ottoman attackers and held their ground. In this victory, the social structure of Souli revealed its true nature. Freedom there was not the possession of men alone, but the collective condition of the entire community. The authority Moscow exercised in that moment was not symbolic. It was command accepted, obeyed, and vindicated in battle. After her husband Lambros, the captain of the Souliotes, was killed in 1792, it was Moscow, the grandmother of Kyriakos, later a general in the Hellenic army and also a prime minister, who assumed the leadership and took over his responsibilities. The later act of December 1803, when the women of Souli, approximately 60 women and their children, chose death with their children, referred to at times as the Dance of Zalongo, rather than submission, must be understood in the light of that earlier reality. It was not a people unfamiliar with combat who made that choice. It was a people who had already fought and won, who knew the meaning of freedom because they had defended it themselves. A European line that passed across the continent captured the moral shock of that world. Quote, "The women preferred death with their children to the chains of Ali Pasha." In that act, the revolution acquired its first universal image, the woman as the guardian of liberty. When the uprising began, the archetype moved immediately from symbol into operational reality. At sea, Laskarina Bouboulina converted commercial wealth into national war. She financed the construction and arming of the Armageddon, paid crews, maintained supply lines, supported the sieges of Napoleon and Montbasia, and mediated between rival leaders. Her house functioned as a command center. Her fortune became powder, cannon, and salaries. Domna Visvizi, after the death of her husband, assumed command of the Kalomira, sold her personal wealth to keep the ship in action, and supplied revolutionary forces in the northern Aegean. Later, when she petitioned the Hellenic state for assistance, the unanswered appeals became documentary proof of the total material sacrifice which independence had been built. And she was not the only one, of course. Manto Mavrogenous, an extraordinary wealthy aristocrat, a Hellenic heroine of the revolution, mobilized diaspora capital for military operations, raised and paid troops for the defense of Mykonos. She put together a flotilla of 6 ships, financed campaigns in the Cyclades and in Chios. She equipped fighters throughout Hellas and wrote to the women of Europe in language that consciously placed the Hellenic struggle within the universal history of freedom. Quote, "The Greeks fight not for themselves alone, but for the liberty of all nations," end quote. She gave everything, all her fortune, for the Hellenic cause. Elizabeth Ypsilanti, called the First Lady of the Philippiateria, sustained the Phanaraic revolutionary network financially, socially, and logistically, making her household a node in the pre-revolutionary political system that prepared the uprising. Elizabeth was one of the main sponsors of the Hellenic Revolution. Yet these visible figures rose from a much larger and more decisive human world. In Hydra, in Spetses, in Psara, women released dowries and commercial capital for the fleet, administered estates and trade networks, and kept the island economies alive for years while the men were at sea. Without their economic governance, the naval war would have collapsed. In mining, the Tower House was both fortress and household. The Maniatises provisioned fighters, produced clothing and ammunition, preserved clan continuity, and in the Battle of Diros in June 24, 1826, took the field themselves. When Ottoman-Egyptian forces attempted to land while the Maniat men were fighting elsewhere, the women, often called the Amazons of Diros, met them with sickles, stones, knives, and farm tools, and drove them back into the sea, preserving the only region of the Moria that never submitted. The Egyptian forces of Ibrahim Pasha suffered 1,000 casualties, and the defeat forced them to abandon attempts to conquer the Mani Peninsula. In Missolonghi, women organized the last food distribution and famine, operated hospitals, carried ammunition in the walls, and walked into the Exodus. Eyewitnesses recorded, quote, "Women with infants at the breast advanced in silence through the fire. Those who survived became the widows in black who raised the nation. In Chios, the enslavement and dispersal of women and children became one of the most powerful humanitarian shocks of the 19th century, transforming European public opinion more effectively than diplomacy. Across Rumeli and the Moria, women sold their dowries for powder, cultivated fields under threat, hid fugitives, served as couriers, and sustained entire communities. Relief appeals repeated the same phrase, quote, "Women and children without bread," end quote. The revolution produced not only heroes, it produced a vast generation of widows and daughters of war. The women who preserved memory and the girls who became the first mothers of the independent state. This reality was intelligible because Hellenic folk culture has long recognized the woman as the bearer of honor and historic continuity. In Kleptic song, she sends men into battle, judges courage, guards the name of the dead, and when necessary, takes up the weapon herself. It was this human world that crossed into Europe. Through the poetry of Felicia Hemans, the Souliote mother entered the emotional bloodstream of romantic Europe. Quote, "We have no tears. We are the daughters of the free, end quote. In Paris, the Salon of Juliette Recamier gathered the Philhellenic intelligentsia. In Switzerland, the philanthropic network of Anna Eynard coordinated clothing, money, and medical supplies for the starving population. In Bavaria, Queen Amalia and the court women supported the committees that would accompany Otto in Elas. In Russia, aristocratic women around Grand Duchess Elena Pavlovna organized collections for Hellenic refugees and students. The American-born Duchess of Plaisance, Sophie de Marbois-Lebrun, carried these worlds into Greece itself, dedicating her fortune to schools, orphan care, and intellectual life. By the way, her former house is now the Byzantine Museum in Athens. Across the Atlantic, the movement became structurally female. In Boston, women of the Greek Relief Committee organized major fundraising fairs. In New York, the Ladies Greek Committee gathered clothing, medicine, and money. In Philadelphia, female societies sponsored Hellenic orphans and educational programs. In Charleston and Baltimore, church-based women's groups produced garments and raised subscriptions. Relief distributed to Elas bore the inscription, quote, "From the Ladies of America," end quote. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, who had served in Elas as a physician, became the distributor of this aid, but its material substance had been created by those women. Through this work, they learned to organize nationally, to manage funds, to influence opinion, and to speak in the language of moral obligation. These same women, including Lydia Maria Child, and those who would later stand with Lucretia Mott and Abby Kelly Foster, carried these methods into the abolitionist movement and the campaign for women's rights in America. The language first used in Elas, liberty, human dignity, the duty to oppose oppression, became the language of those later struggles. Seen in its entirety, this is one continuous historical movement, from the battlefield led by Moscho Tzabella and a Souliote woman, to Bouboulina's fleet, to Visvizi's sacrifice, to Mavrogenous' letters and also sacrifice, to the Magneticus at Diros, to the Missolonghi Exodus, to the Chios dowry, to the widow in black, to the refugee girl of 1821, to the salons of Europe, to the ladies of America, to the platforms of abolition and suffrage. Women sustained the material life of the war, created its international support, preserved its moral meaning, and transmitted its legacy into the modern world. They did not stand at the margins of the Greek Revolution. They made its survival possible. They made its meaning universal. They carried it across continents and into the future. They were not a secondary chapter in its history. They are its human foundations. And if we are to understand the Hellenic Revolution in its fullest and most truthful form, we must see that these women were not an auxiliary presence, not a supporting narrative, but a living continuum that binds together sacrifice and statehood, battlefield and memory, nation and humanity. For it was they who endured that struggle, did not end with a victory or a treaty. It was they who transformed suffering into legitimacy. It was they who carried the revolution from the mountains of Souli to the consciousness of Europe, from the burning houses of Chios into the churches and halls of America, and from the widowed households of Elas into the reform movements that reshaped the modern world. Through them, the Greek cause became more than a national uprising. It became a universal language of freedom. And through them, the revolution did not remain in the past. It entered history as a permanent moral inheritance. To speak of 1821, therefore, is to speak of a world in which women stood at every decisive point. In battle, in famine, in exile, in diplomacy, in charity, in memory, and to recognize that without them, there is no continuity between destruction and independence, no bridge between the lost and the world, no living legacy. This is not an act of commemoration. This is an act of historical restoration. Because in restoring them to the center of the narrative, we restore the revolution itself to the full human dimension, and we understand at last how freedom survives. Zito Elas, God bless America. Okay, we're going to take a break now, and don't forget we're going to start at 7 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
Mr. Group, before the confederation flag,